0. There are moments in life when you hear a story that seems too good to be true, stories about warnings, visions of the future, men and women who claim to have received messages that no one else can see or understand at that moment. For years, I was skeptical of those kinds of stories. I believed in God, yes, but I thought many of the stories about modern prophecies were exaggerations or human interpretations of ordinary events. Until I met the man who would change my perspective. What I'm about to share isn't a conspiracy theory or a story made up to scare anyone. It's a testimony, an account of things I experienced, of conversations I overheard, and of warnings that, over time, began to come true in ways that no one could have imagined. It all started with a message that spoke of wars between superpowers, of tensions between nations like the United States, Russia, and Iran, of unexpected alliances, of global economic crises, and of a time of famine that would shake many regions of the planet. But the most surprising thing of all wasn't the war, it was the spiritual calling that accompanied those warnings. Because that man insisted on something again and again, that before every great upheaval in history, God always sends a warning, and according to him, that warning had already begun. My name is Daniel Serrano. I was born in Seville, Spain, and for many years I worked as a freelance journalist covering social and cultural issues. I wasn't an expert in theology or biblical prophecy. In fact, if someone had told me I would end up telling a story like this, I probably would have laughed. But everything changed the day I received a strange email from a pastor in northern Spain. In that message there was only one sentence: there is a man who claims to have seen the beginning of World War III and says that God showed him how it will begin. That was the beginning of it all. The first time I heard that man's name was on a rainy afternoon in November. The pastor who had written to me arranged to meet me at a small evangelical church on the outskirts of Santander. It wasn't an impressive place. It was a simple building with white walls, a few wooden pews, and a cross hanging behind the pulpit. I arrived with my recorder, my notebook, and the typical skepticism of someone who has heard too many exaggerated stories. The pastor greeted me with a calm smile. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You mentioned in your message that someone had something important to tell me," I replied. The pastor nodded slowly. "Not just you, but the world." That sentence made me raise an eyebrow. "And who exactly is this person?" The pastor glanced toward the side door of the church. "His name is Elias Navaro." At that moment, the door opened. The man who entered didn't look like the kind of person one imagines when hearing the word prophet. He wasn't dressed strangely or had an eccentric appearance. He was a man in his 50s with a short beard, a deep gaze, and a calm expression. He approached slowly. "Daniel Serrano said," extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." I shook his hand. "The pastor says you have something to tell me." Elias looked at me for a few seconds before answering. "I didn't come to convince you of anything," he said calmly. "I just came to warn you." I took out my recorder. "Warn you about what?" Elias sat down on one of the pews across from me. For a few seconds he was silent as if he were carefully considering his words. Then he spoke. "6 months ago I had a vision while I was praying. I wrote it down. I kept my notebook open without looking up. A vision of Elias taking a deep breath of war. I looked up. What kind of war?" His answer was so calm it sent an unexpected chill through me. "A world war." Rain pounded against the windows of the small temple as he continued speaking. "I saw tensions rising between nations that have distrusted each other for years. The United States, Russia, Iran, alliances forming and breaking, conflicts starting in small regions but rapidly escalating." I looked at him intently. "That sounds like political analysis, not a vision." Elias shook his head. "No, because I also saw something else." "What?" His eyes grew more serious. "I saw hunger." The word hung in the air. Dry fields, cities with shortages, supply chains collapsing, people desperately searching for food. Wars always lead to economic crises. I said, "This isn't anything new." Elias looked directly at me. "This will be different." I remained silent. The man continued, "It won't just be a military conflict, it will be a global upheaval, economic, social, spiritual. Spiritual?" Elias nodded. because in the midst of the chaos, many people will begin to seek God. The rain was still falling heavily outside. I looked at my notebook full of notes. And why are you telling me this? Elias answered without hesitating, because warnings must be heeded before events occur. I remained silent for a few seconds. And when will all this happen? Elias didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the cross at the back of the temple. Then he said something I'll never forget. It's already begun. At that moment, I thought that story would be just another curious report. I had no idea that in the following months I would begin to see signs that would remind me of every word that man had said. And what worried me most wasn't the possibility of war, it was something that Elijah told me just before I left that night. He approached me at the temple door and spoke in a low voice. The war will be terrible. He paused. But it won't be the most dangerous thing to come. I looked at him, confused. Then what is the most dangerous thing? Elias answered with a phrase that still echoes in my memory, that the world doesn't heed the warning before it's too late. I left the church in Santander with more questions than answers. The rain was still falling heavily, and the cold air of northern Spain seemed to have intensified the weight of the words I had just heard. As I walked to the car, I mentally replayed the conversation with Elias Navaro, a vision of a world war, conflicts between superpowers, global famine, a spiritual awakening. As a journalist, my mind was trained to analyze everything with skepticism. I had interviewed many people who claimed to have revelations or divine messages. Most of the time, those stories turned out to be personal interpretations, exaggerations, or simple human errors. However, there was something about the way Elias spoke that made me uncomfortable. He wasn't trying to impress, he wasn't raising his voice. He didn't seem like someone seeking fame, he just spoke with a quiet confidence that was hard to ignore. I started the car and began driving toward the hotel where I was staying. As I drove along the wet road, I made a decision. Before writing anything about that man, I would investigate his story. That same night, I called the pastor who had sent me the email. I need to know more about Elias, I said. The pastor was silent for a few seconds before answering. He's not someone who seeks attention. I already noticed that. For years, he was a completely ordinary man. He worked as an engineer at an electric company near Bilbao. He had a family, a quiet life, nothing out of the ordinary. And when did all this start? About a year ago. I jotted the information down in my notebook. What happened? The pastor sighed. According to him, he began having very intense dreams while praying. At first, I thought they were just spiritual impressions, but over time, the visions became clearer, more detailed. Visions of war, yes, but not only of war. I settled back into the hotel chair. What else did you see? The pastor answered in a lower voice. Global economic crises, escalating diplomatic conflicts, attacks that provoke military responses, and something he calls the winter of hunger. The phrase caught my attention. The winter of hunger, that's what he said. After hanging up, I spent several hours researching. I reviewed articles, recent political speeches, and international reports on geopolitical tensions. It wasn't hard to find signs of conflict between major powers. Relations between the United States, Russia, and Iran had been fraught for years, but that didn't mean the world was on the brink of a third world war. Still, something compelled me to investigate further. The next morning, I met with Elias again. This time it wasn't at the church, but at a small cafe near the port. The place was almost empty. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Elias was already seated when I arrived. I knew you'd come back, he said with a slight smile. I sat down across from him. Let's just say his story piqued my curiosity. I took out my notebook. I want you to explain something to me. Go ahead. You said the war has already started, but there isn't a global conflict right now. Elias shook his head slowly. Modern wars don't start the day the first missiles are fired, so when do they start? Elias took a sip of coffee before answering. Invisible tensions begin. He leaned slightly forward. They begin with shifting alliances, weakening economies, and regional conflicts that major powers use as pawns on a chessboard. I jotted down the word And what exactly did you see in your vision? Elias was silent for a few seconds, then spoke. I saw a crisis in the Middle East directly involving Iran. I looked up. That happens often, but this time it will be different. Why? Elias took a deep breath. Because Russia will get more directly involved, and the United States will respond to protect its interests and its allies. I felt a slight chill run through me. And Europe? Elias looked at me gravely. Europe will try to stay out of it at first, but it won't be able to for long. I glanced out the cafe window. The sea was grey and choppy. How does famine fit into all of this? I asked. Elias answered with a sentence that I immediately jotted down. When supply chains break down, famine appears faster than people realize. He looked directly at me again. Closed ports, blocked trade, limited energy, fields that can't be cultivated because the machinery depends on fuel that no longer arrives. Silence settled between us. After a few seconds, I asked what troubled me most. If God showed him all this, why? Elias didn't hesitate to warn. Warn whom? His answer was simple, everyone. And what are we supposed to do with that warning? Elias placed his hands on the table. Prepare your heart. Frown. The heart. Crises reveal what's truly inside people. He paused before continuing. When scarcity arrives, when fear grows, when the world shakes, many will seek answers. I looked at him intently. And you believe those answers lie in faith? Elias nodded. They've always been there. I finished my coffee in silence. Before leaving, I asked him one last question. If all this is true, how much time do we have? Elias looked at the sky through the window. His answer was brief. Less than you imagine. At that moment, I thought I was just hearing an exaggerated warning, but a few weeks later, something happened in the international news that made me remember every word of that conversation. The following weeks, I returned to Seville with my mind full of doubts. I had interviewed many people with strange stories, but usually, after a few days, the interest faded. You write the report, publish the article, and move on to the next topic, but that wasn't happening with Elias Navaro. His words kept swirling in my head. Modern wars don't begin the day the missiles are launched, they begin with invisible tensions. I tried to focus on other work, but every time I opened an international news website, I found something that reminded me of that conversation in the Santander Cafe. Headlines about new economic sanctions, tense diplomatic meetings, military movements in strategic regions. Nothing out of the ordinary, but not entirely reassuring either. One afternoon, while reviewing geopolitical reports for a different article, a news item appeared that caught my attention. A conflict in the Middle East had escalated more than expected. There were threats between governments, accusations flying back and forth, and military movements that were beginning to worry international analysts. It wasn't a war yet, but it was exactly the kind of scenario Elias has mentioned. I closed my computer and stared at the blank screen for a few seconds. It could be a coincidence. The Middle East has been an unstable region for decades. Anyone with a basic understanding of international politics could predict tensions in that area. Even so, something compelled me to make a call. I dialed Elias's number. He answered after several rings. Hello, Daniel. I was watching the news, I said bluntly. Me too. It has to do with what you saw. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. It's one of the pieces. I leaned back in my chair. You mentioned several nations involved. Yes, the United States, Russia, Iran. Elias replied calmly. Tensions between those countries aren't new, but in my vision, I saw something different. I saw how a regional conflict was turning into a chain of reactions. I picked up my notebook. Explain that to me. Elias spoke in a calm, almost pedagogical voice. An attack provokes a response. The response provokes an alliance. The alliance provokes a reaction from another power, and so begins an escalation that no one can stop, easily stopped. That sounds like the beginning of many wars in history. Exactly. I pondered his vision for a few seconds. What sparked it? Elias took a while to answer. I didn't see a specific event. I saw a build-up of tensions, like indirect attacks, sabotage. Disputes over resources, economic pressure? I jotted down every word, then I asked something that worried me. And Europe? Elias sighed. Europe will think it's far removed from the conflict. At first, I looked out the window of my apartment in Seville. The streets were full of people walking, tourists, children playing in a nearby square. It was hard to imagine that a global conflict could disrupt such a normal life. You also spoke of famine, I said. Yes, how can a war cause worldwide famine? Elias responded with a question. Do you know how many countries depend on imports to feed their populations? No, I replied. Many more than people imagine. He continued. If ports cease to function normally, if international trade grinds to a halt, if fuel runs out, supply chains begin to break down. I remained silent, and when the chains break, he said, food stops arriving. I felt a slight chill. But the world has reserves, emergency systems. Yes, Elias said, but it also has millions of people living on the edge every day. The conversation fell silent for a moment. Finally, I asked something that had been bothering me since the first interview. In his view, war is inevitable. Elias responded in a way I hadn't expected. Human decisions can change many things. I frowned. So, could this be avoided? Perhaps. And what would it take to avoid it? Elias answered with one word, wisdom. I chuckled. That seems to be in short supply in international politics. That's why God warns before crises erupt. His words made me think, do you believe these visions come directly from God? I'm convinced. And why would he choose someone like you? Elijah was silent for a few seconds, then he said something that I immediately jotted down. Because God often uses ordinary people to deliver extraordinary messages. After hanging up, I spent a long time thinking. I didn't know whether to believe Elijah's story, but I did know one thing for sure. International news was beginning to move in a disturbing direction. That night I decided to do something I hadn't done since my teens. I opened a Bible I had stored on a bookshelf. I remembered something Elijah had mentioned in our first conversation. That global crises they were always accompanied by spiritual warnings. I began to read some passages related to times of war and scarcity. One in particular caught my attention. It spoke of rumors of wars, of nations rising against nations, and of difficult times before a profound change in the world. I slowly closed the book. I didn't know if what Elias had seen was a prophecy or simply a spiritual interpretation of reality, but at that moment, a question began to form in my mind. What if it wasn't just a warning for the world, but also a warning for me? I couldn't imagine that very soon there would begin to be much clearer signs that something big was changing on the international stage, and that these signs would force me to see Elias again sooner than I expected. The following months were marked by a strange feeling that I couldn't explain. Life went on as usual in Seville. The terraces were full, tourists strolled through the historic center, and flamenco guitars filled the air in some bars at night. Everything seemed exactly the same, but something inside me had changed since I met Elias Navaro. I no longer saw the news the same way. Before, I observed it like a journalist. Facts, figures, political analysis, official statements, everything fit within a professional logic. Now, each headline seemed like a piece of a larger puzzle, and some pieces were beginning to fit together in a disturbing way. One morning, I received a message from a colleague who covered international affairs. It simply said, "Have you seen what's happening with the energy routes?" I opened the link he sent me. It was a report on new trade and military tensions related to oil and gas in various regions of the world. There were disputes in the Black Sea, increasingly harsh economic sanctions between the United States and Russia, and new military agreements between countries in the Middle East. None of it was technically a war, but it was exactly the kind of pressure that, according to Elias, could ignite something much bigger. I spent several hours reading reports and analyses. The more I investigated, the more I understood one thing: the international balance was becoming fragile, alliances were shifting, rhetoric was growing more aggressive, and diplomacy seemed increasingly strained. That afternoon, I decided to do something impulsive. I took the train to Santander. I hadn't told Elias I was coming, I just felt I needed to talk to him again. When I arrived at the small church where I had met him, the building was almost empty. Only a few people were arranging chairs and tidying up after a meeting. Elias was there. He seemed surprised to see me, but he smiled calmly. "I knew you'd come back." "How?" When someone starts asking deep questions, they rarely stop at the first conversation. We sat on a wooden pew near the altar. I pulled out my notebook, filled with notes. Tensions arising, I told him. Elias nodded slowly. "Yes, this is what you saw," I said, looking directly at him. "I need to understand something." "Go ahead." I took a deep breath before asking, "If all this is related to a prophecy, where does it appear in the Bible?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He stood up, walked over to a small table, and returned with a rather worn Bible. He opened it carefully. "There are several passages that speak of times of global conflict," he said, "but many believe they refer to very distant or symbolic events." He pointed to a text. "Here it mentions that nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom." I read the verse silently. "That has happened many times in history." "That's true," Elias replied, "but the context also speaks of simultaneous crises." "What kind of crises?" "Wars, shortages, global fear." I thought about what I had read about energy routes. The world economy depends on stability. I said, "If the tensions escalate into war, the impact would be enormous." "Exactly." Elias turned to another passage. "It also mentions famine in various parts of the world." I looked up. "The famine you mentioned?" "Yes." I felt a slight knot in my stomach, "but the modern world produces more food than ever." Elias slowly closed the Bible. "The problem isn't always production." "Then what is distribution?" That made me think of a globalized world. Food travels thousands of miles before reaching cities. If international trade stops, if fuels become scarce, if ports cease to function, the food simply stops arriving. In my vision, Elias continued, I saw empty supermarkets in various cities around the world. I felt a chill, including in Europe. Yes, I stared at the floor for a few seconds. That would be social chaos. Famine always causes it. Silence filled the church for a few moments. Then I asked something that had been on my mind for days. If these prophecies are warnings, what does God expect us to do? Elijah looked at me with a serene expression, preparing our hearts spiritually. Exactly, I frowned. But people would prepare with food, resources, shelter. Elijah shook his head gently. Those preparations can help, but they don't solve the deeper problem. What is it? The spiritual condition of humanity. His words resonated in my mind. So, you believe these crises are a wake-up call? Yes, for people to return to God. Exactly. We left the church as it was getting dark. The city lights illuminated the damp streets after a light rain. Before we said goodbye, Elias said something that stayed with me throughout the entire journey home. Wars change maps, he said, but spiritual crises change souls. That night, as the train hurtled toward Seville, I stared out the window at the dark landscape whizzing past, and for the first time, I began to wonder if the story I was investigating wasn't just a news report. Perhaps it was a real warning. A warning to the world and maybe even to my own life. I returned with the feeling that my life had been divided into two stages, before meeting Elias Navaro and after. For years I had worked as a journalist, analyzing conflicts, politics, and international economics. I liked to think I saw the world objectively. But now I was beginning to feel uneasy. Many of the things Elias had mentioned were starting to appear more frequently in the reports I reviewed each day. They weren't proof of a world war, but they were signs that the international landscape was rapidly shifting. One Monday morning, while checking the global news, a headline popped up that made me stop. A military incident between U.S. allied forces and Iranian-backed units had triggered an escalation of threats between the two governments. Nothing entirely new, but the tone of the statements was different, more aggressive, more direct. Afterward, another report indicated that Russia had conducted military exercises near a strategic region. I opened several expert analyses. Many agreed on one thing: The balance of power among the great powers was entering a dangerous phase. I remembered Elias's words, a chain of reactions that no one will be able to easily stop. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair,